Good evening and welcome to the Gospel of Matthew. We're now turning to this next section, Matthew 13 through 17, and we'll spend time on two parts of this section, chapter 13 and then chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Matthew 13 is the middle sermon in the five sermons that Jesus preaches. We've already looked at the first one, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, which is one of the longer sermons that Jesus preaches in the Gospel of Matthew. Then we paid close attention to Matthew chapter 10 last week, and the sermon dealing with missionary travel and how to engage others related to the gospel and who not to engage. This week's section, his sermon in Matthew chapter 13, deals with something a little bit different. It's a little bit more difficult sermon in some ways, just from the standpoint of structure. So we'll pay close attention to Matthew 13 and how Matthew uses his sources, both Mark and Q, to construct that sermon. And then we'll spend some time towards the end of this lecture dealing with the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15. So this is kind of the overview of what we'll be doing, looking at Jesus' third sermon, the seven parables of this sermon, the way he uses Mark and Q. We're going to look at the role of the disciples, which is real interesting in Matthew versus the Gospel of Mark in particular. And then spend some time with the stereotypical Gentile, the Canaanite woman. What does it mean to be a Canaanite? Why is Matthew using that? We'll talk about the progression of the conversation that he has with the woman, and then look at Jesus' interaction with Gentiles, misspelling there in Matthew. So, is this Jesus' interaction with Gentiles? Or is this the way Matthew understands Gentiles in his gospel? So let's look at this third sermon of Jesus in Matthew chapter 13, these seven parables and faithful disciples. Chapter 13, you can look at the way the sermon is structured. The first 23 verses is all about the parable of the sower. This is the sermon, this is the parable that deals with a sower goes out, or a planter, and plants seed, throws seed on the ground. And the parable is really about the type of soil. There's this good and fertile soil, the seed falls in and it grows the way it's supposed to. And then there's other soil that's not as good. Some of the seeds fall along the path, and that's no place for the seed to grow, so it doesn't work out well. Some seeds fall among thorns. The thorns choke it, so it doesn't grow the way it should. Things of that nature. So it really has to do with how this good news will be implanted in people. The soil is really people. Then you have the parable of the weeds among the wheat, and this is a parable that deals with weeds and wheat growing together, and how you can't pull out the weeds or you'll pull out the wheat, so you have to wait till harvest time. Then a very familiar parable of the mustard seed. This is dealing with the kingdom of God, or the empire of God, starting off very small and growing to something very big. The parable of the yeast does the same thing. So the first two parables have to deal with Matthew's community, really. Who's in his community, who are the good ones. And it goes without saying in these two parables that there are some good people in the community and some bad people in the community. And those bad people need to be weeded out, literally, according to Matthew. So this has everything to do with the community. These two, the seed and the yeast, have to do with more the preaching of this community, this Jesus-following community, and why that message, that good news, is attractive to some. The idea that this good news will spread and grow. And then the three parables that Matthew puts at the very end of this section is real interesting because they all three deal specifically with community and the good news. So what I'd like for us to do in this section, let me just check here. Yeah, we'll go back here. Is pay real close attention to how Matthew uses these sources. Now, we're going to get into this in a little bit. So I'll wait until we get into Matthew's use of Q source and Mark. But I just wanted to show you here how this sermon is divided. And what you need to do, if you need to do it now, you can pause this video and then go ahead and read chapter 13 of Matthew and then see for yourself what this looks like. Moving on to the role of the disciples in the Gospel of Matthew. This is real interesting. So this is another exercise where you need to pause and go back and read. So I need you to read Matthew chapter 13, 10 through 17, 34 through 35, then 36 through 43, and then 51 through 53. Go ahead and read these passages and answer this question. Are the disciples portrayed in a positive or negative light in these verses? So go ahead and pause the video, read these passages, and then answer that question. Are the disciples portrayed in a positive or negative light? So hit the pause now. So I hope you hit that pause button and did all your reading. That made it very helpful for you to answer these kind of questions. But the use of the disciples in Jesus, the disciples of Jesus in Matthew, is real interesting, mainly for his context in Antioch. We know that Matthew uses the Gospel of Mark as a source. And in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples of Jesus are never ever portrayed in a good light. They are always lampooned almost. They never fully understand. They never fully get it. And so the disciples of Jesus, the eyewitnesses of Jesus, the people who are around Jesus throughout his ministry, are never portrayed in a good light in the Gospel of Mark. Now that's important in the Gospel of Mark because the Gospel of Mark is associated with Paul in some profound ways theologically. So Paul never was an eyewitness to Jesus. He only had this experience after Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. So Paul tells his own story about encountering the risen Christ, but Paul was not a part of these original 12 disciples. And Paul has, in his own writings, serious confrontation with these very disciples who were with Jesus. So Paul always has this tenuous relationship with the disciples. And the Gospel of Mark is in keeping with Paul's theology. Now, the Gospel of Mark was not written by Paul, but it was certainly somebody influenced by Paul. So Paul, while he certainly never shows up in the Gospel of Mark, probably was influential in the writing of that gospel. And so, from the Paul's perspective, the disciples were never considered truly faithful or as faithful as they should have been. And then in Matthew, that's written in Antioch, takes much more of a conservative view on Gentiles and the Jesus movement. Always argues for acceptance of the law. Certainly looks like a gospel that would have been confrontational to Paul's theology. Okay, so most likely Matthew's not just kind of cleaning up Mark. He's using Mark as a source to write this gospel. And as he does, he's redeeming the disciples in some profound ways because the disciples have it right in Matthew throughout. And if you read these passages, Matthew certainly portrays them in a positive light. Specifically, Peter among those disciples, he is a good guy in the Gospel of Matthew. And this is important because of Matthew's context in Antioch. We know from Paul's writings that Paul and Peter had a confrontation in the city of Antioch related to Gentiles and law observance. So Matthew has the disciples doing everything right. They answer the right questions. They have an understanding, a right understanding of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, and that has everything to do with Matthew's stance on this, on his kind of maybe not anti-Paul, but he's certainly trying to correct this law-free understanding for Gentiles in the Jesus movement. And Matthew is pushing back and rewriting Mark in that way. So the role of the disciples are important throughout the Gospel of Matthew for these kind of purposes. They serve his purposes in his own context and in Antioch. All right, let's move. I know we're moving quickly here, but when I ask you to pause these videos, I really do need you to pause them so that you can read these passages. And we'll pause it again during this section. So now let's look at Matthew's use of Mark and Q. This sermon of seven parables gives us a great example of how Matthew constructed sermons for Jesus in his gospel. We know that he constructed 5 sermons for Jesus, and this is the middle one, right? So if you can, go ahead and pause this. Go to our e-learning site. I've uploaded a document that says Matthew 13 parallel. Now, this is what that document's going to look like, the first page of it. I need you to go there and go ahead and read through it again and look at how this parallels Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? It shows you here exactly where Matthew is using the Gospel of Mark. These are the passages that Matthew are reading when he's writing this right here. You'll also see where and how Luke uses the same part of Mark, okay? And that's important because as Matthew writes this sermon on Jesus, he uses both Mark and Q. These are the common sources he has. But there are also large sections of Matthew of this sermon that are unique to Matthew's gospel. Now let me see if I can pull that up for you real quick. All right. So hopefully you will see this. This is exactly the document on e-learning. So this is the parable of the sower, Matthew 13, 1 through 9. And you'll see exactly how Matthew uses the Gospel of Mark here, right? This is Mark, this is Matthew, and it's almost verbatim. It's very close. Luke is much more loose in his writing or rewriting of this story, as you can see. But Matthew follows Mark closely. And here it even shows you there's a little section in John that's probably unintentional and certainly not a literary connection. But all the way down, you'll see how Matthew uses Mark and where it differs from Luke. We'll keep going. Here, this whole section is absent in Mark. This section where Matthew and Luke continue to write. And it gets into this next section here, is the interpretation of the parable. And you'll see how some of this Matthew edits out, mainly because this makes it look like the disciples aren't fully understanding. So Matthew says, "Hear then the parable of the sower." So here in Matthew, Jesus is talking to his disciples and giving them exactly what the meaning is for this. Here, Mark says, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" So already you see here this almost frustration that Jesus has with the disciples. This runs throughout the Gospel of Mark. And you'll see how Matthew basically just edits that out completely. Hear then the parable of the sower. So he tells the disciples that, and there's the full understanding that the disciples get it. And you can see how that's edited here between Mark and Matthew. So this is why this parallel is helpful. It puts the 3 Gospels side by side so that you can see exactly the difference between the 2. And this will be important for you later on because you'll have an exercise you'll have to follow. So go back to that, read those parallels, look at exactly how Matthew uses Mark and Q. And so the Q source, let me go back to that document real quick because when you have three columns side by side, that's Luke and Matthew using Mark as a source. Okay, now you follow this down. This section's only in Mark. Matthew and Luke don't use it. This section, chapter 13, verses 24 through 30, it's important because this is the parable of the tares, or the wheat that's the weeds that are mixed with the wheat. This is totally unique to Matthew. So where there's a section that's completely unique to Matthew, either Matthew has a source that Luke does not have and Mark didn't have, or Matthew is creating this by himself. So whenever you get to a section that is completely unique to Matthew, this is our clearest picture of Matthew's own convictions or set of assumptions or theology even. So it's really important. If you want to know Matthew, read the things that are unique to him, because he's putting that in there for himself, for his own theology. Here you'll see how, again, they go back to Mark. This is Matthew using Mark. And this is a great example of the Q source. You see how this is not in Mark, but it's in Matthew and Luke. The way they constructed this gives you an idea of what the Q source would look like, because this is where Matthew and Luke agree with each other literally, almost verbatim, but it's not in Mark. So this is another example of where we think the Q source. And as you scroll down, you'll see how Matthew uses Mark here. Something again unique to Matthew. This is the interpretation of the tares. Hidden treasure. I think these are just three quick parables that are unique to Matthew. He includes them, and then and I think that's the end of the gospel. So you get an idea with these parallels, and this document is on our e-learning site. This is a great visual of these passages, of how Matthew and Luke are using the Q source, or how Matthew is using Mark in this interpretation. So Matthew, you saw the large sections of the sermon that are unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And again, I've already told you that the material unique to Matthew is either another source or simply Matthew creating the material for the gospel. But whatever the case, when you find that, that's very important, because it gives you a real clear idea of Matthew. So go back to that document on e-learning site that says Matthew 13 parallel, and read it real carefully, and read Matthew, both Mark and Luke as well. And you'll see how Matthew is using Mark, refining Mark, specifically with disciples in this sermon. But you'll also see one little section where he and Luke are using the Q source. Again, this document is on your e-learning site, so go check that out. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the stereotypical Gentile in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. This is paralleled in Mark 7, 24 through 30. That's also on our e-learning site, so you can find that there. All right. Here you're going to have to pause again and go back and read. I need you to read the parallel passages in Matthew and Mark. And I want you to make a list of all the differences between the two. And then answer this question: who has the most negative view of the woman, Matthew or Mark? So I'll actually pull this up for you so that you can see it. Well, this is not going to have everything for you. Let me see if I can move this around. Okay. So this is the two parallel versions in there. We're going to do that. There. So these are the two parallel passages in Matthew and Matthew and Mark. You notice that it's completely absent in Luke, and that is very important. So, again, take some time, go ahead, and just a few minutes, I'll say pause, hit the pause button, read through these parallel passages, write down everywhere that's significantly different between these two versions of the same story, and then determine who has a more negative view of this woman, the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew. So, right now, go ahead and hit the pause button and read and answer that question. All right, we're back. Hopefully, you've got a good idea of Matthew chapter 15, 21 through 28, and the Canaanite woman, as Matthew calls her. Let's kind of finish up with this. Matthew uses Canaanite rather than Syrophoenician in order to make the story even more mythical. Syrophoenicia was actually an area of Syria, and this is Antioch, where Matthew wrote this gospel, was in Syria. So Syrophoenician was a kind of person. It was an ethnic group in the time of Jesus and in the time of Matthew. And it would have been in the area where Matthew was. So it's really interesting that Matthew actually changes the name to Canaanite, knowing that he's using Mark. So he takes the name Syrophoenician and he substitutes with Canaanite. And he does this for a couple of reasons. I think probably Syrophoenician maybe was too close to home for Matthew. And he wanted to make this story almost mythical, mainly because Canaanites, they were the ancient enemy of Israel that had been annihilated. The Canaanites didn't exist in Matthew's day. The Canaanites didn't exist in Jesus's day. The Canaanites had all died out or had been killed out thousands of years before Jesus. Canaanites hadn't existed on the earth for hundreds of years when Matthew wrote his gospel. So this is why I'm saying it's a mythical story, because everybody who would have heard this story in Matthew's time, everybody in Antioch, when they heard Canaanite, they would have known that this story is a story. It is almost an illustration, not a real thing that actually happened. So Matthew is becoming a storyteller here because Canaanites were all killed off. So the Canaanite represents the quintessential Gentile, non-Judean. Not just the non-Judean Gentile, but the most hostile Gentiles there were. The worst kind of Gentile, really. And you can read in Matthew's section that Jesus clearly doesn't want to engage this person, but relents because of two things. One, the woman was persistent. She kept coming back. Jesus wouldn't answer her at the beginning. Then when he did answer, he talked to the disciples. He talked to the disciples about her in front of her. And then finally he spoke to her. So she was persistent the whole time. And then it was her faith that really sealed the deal for Jesus. And he did what she asked him to do, but very reluctantly. So how does this woman function for Matthew's conception of Gentiles? It's clear that Gentiles are important to Matthew, but they are always stereotypes. It's clear that Matthew doesn't really know any Gentiles. Every Gentile in Matthew's gospel is just a walking stereotype. And this woman is even more of a stereotype because she's a Canaanite. She's not even a real human being. So Gentiles are people who Jesus reluctantly accepts because they are persistent and have a lot of faith. And that's exactly how Matthew understands Gentiles. This story has major implications for Matthew's community in Antioch, which is in Syria, because this is the issue they're dealing with. How are Gentiles incorporated into this early Jesus movement, which is still Jewish? Well, this is the answer to that. They are allowed in if they have extraordinary faith and are persistent about it. Matthew lets these Gentiles in, but very reluctantly. So the way Jesus handles the Canaanite woman in this story is exactly the way Matthew handles Gentiles in his own community. And it's the way he recommends people to deal with Gentiles in his community. So I hope this lecture has been important to you, been helpful for you in a number of ways. I hope you've been able to kind of read through chapter 13, see these seven parables that makes the central sermon of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Yeah, you'll be able to see. I hope you've been able to see how Matthew uses Mark and Q to construct this sermon. You'll also see a marked difference in the role of the disciples in the Gospel of Matthew versus his source, the Gospel of Luke. And then finally, we got to see this stereotypical Gentile, this mythical Canaanite, how that interaction progressed from Jesus not engaging the woman to finally doing her bidding and healing her daughter. So Jesus' interaction with Gentiles is actually Matthew's understanding of how Gentiles should be incorporated into this Jewish Jesus movement in Antioch. That's the lecture for tonight. I hope you've been able to uh, listen to the whole thing and do all these readings at the same time. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email and ask me. Hope you're doing well. Be well.